Chapter 3. Settling the Northern Colonies, 1619 to 1700. Although colonists both North and South were bound together by a common language and a common allegiance to Mother England, they established different patterns of settlement, different economies, different political systems, and even different sets of values, defining distinctive regional characteristics that would persist for generations. The promise of riches, especially from golden-leaved tobacco, drew the first settlers to the southern colonies, but to the north, in the fertile valleys of the middle Atlantic region, and especially along the rocky shores of New England, it was not worldly wealth, but religious devotion that principally shaped the earliest settlements. Little did the German friar Martin Luther suspect, when he nailed his protests against Catholic doctrines to the door of Wittenberg's cathedral in 1517, that he was shaping the destiny of a yet unknown nation. Denouncing the authority of priests and popes, Luther declared that the Bible alone was the source of God's word. He ignited a fire of religious reform, the Protestant Reformation, that licked its way across Europe for more than a century, dividing peoples, toppling sovereigns, and kindling the spiritual fervor of millions of men and women, some of whom helped to found America. The reforming flame burned especially brightly in the bosom of John Calvin of Geneva. This somber and severe religious leader elaborated Martin Luther's ideas in ways that profoundly affected the thought and character of generations of Americans yet unborn. Calvinism became the dominant theological credo, not only of the New England Puritans, but of other American settlers as well, including the Scottish Presbyterians, French Huguenots, and communicants of the Dutch Reformed Church. Calvin spelled out his basic doctrine in a learned Latin tome of 1536 entitled Institutes of the Christian Religion. God, Calvin argued, was all-powerful and all good. Humans, because of the corrupting effect of original sin, were weak and wicked. God was also all-knowing, and he knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Since the first moment of creation, some souls, the elect, had been destined for eternal bliss, and others for eternal torment. Good works could not save those whom predestination had marked for the infernal fires. But neither could the elect count on their predetermined salvation and lead lives of wild, immoral abandon. For one thing, no one could be certain of his or her status in the heavenly ledger. Gnawing doubts about their eternal fate plagued Calvinists. They constantly sought, in themselves and others, signs of conversion, or the receipt of God's free gift of saving grace. Conversion was thought to be an intense, identifiable personal experience in which God revealed to the elect their heavenly destiny. Thereafter, they were expected to lead sanctified lives, demonstrating by their holy behavior that they were among the visible saints. These doctrines swept into England just as King Henry VIII was breaking his ties with the Roman Catholic Church in the 1530s, making himself the head of the Church of England. Henry would have been content to retain Roman rituals and creeds, but his action powerfully stimulated some English religious reformers to undertake a total purification of English Christianity. Many of these Puritans, as it happened, came from the commercially depressed woolen districts. Calvinism, with its message of stark but reassuring order in the divine plan, fed on this social unrest and provided spiritual comfort to the economically disadvantaged. As time went on, Puritans grew increasingly unhappy over the snail-like progress of the Protestant Reformation in England. They burned with pious zeal to see the Church of England wholly de-Catholicized. The most devout Puritans, including those who eventually settled New England, believed that only visible saints, that is, persons who felt the stirrings of grace in their souls and could demonstrate its presence to their fellow Puritans, should be admitted to church membership. But the Church of England enrolled all the king's subjects, which meant that the saints had to share pews and communion rails with the damned. Appalled by this unholy fraternizing, a tiny group of dedicated Puritans, known as Separatists, vowed to break away entirely from the Church of England. King James I, a shrewd Scotsman, was head of both the state and the church in England from 1603 to 1625. He quickly perceived that if his subjects could defy him as their spiritual leader, they might one day defy him as their political leader, as in fact they would later defy and behead his son, Charles I. He therefore threatened to harass the more bothersome separatists out of the land. The most famous congregation of separatists, fleeing royal wrath, departed for Holland in 1608. During the ensuing 12 years of toil and poverty, they were increasingly distressed by the Dutchification of their children. They longed to find a haven where they could live and die as English men and women, and as purified Protestants. America was the logical refuge. Despite the early ordeals of Jamestown, and despite tales of New World cannibals roasting steaks from their white victims over open fires. A group of the separatists in Holland, after negotiating with the Virginia Company, at length secured rights to settle under its jurisdiction. But their crowded Mayflower, 65 days at sea, missed its destination and arrived off the stony coast of New England in 1620, with a total of 102 persons. One had died en route, an unusually short casualty list, and one had been born, and appropriately named Oceanus. Fewer than half of the entire party were separatists. Prominent among the non-believers was a peppery and stocky soldier of fortune, Captain Miles Standish, dubbed by one of his critics Captain Shrimp. He later rendered indispensable service as an Indian fighter and negotiator. The Pilgrims did not make their initial landing at Plymouth Rock as commonly supposed, but undertook a number of preliminary surveys. They finally chose for their site the shore of inhospitable Plymouth Bay. This area was outside the domain of the Virginia Company, and consequently the settlers became squatters. They were without legal right to the land and without specific authority to establish a government. Before disembarking, the Pilgrim leaders drew up and signed the brief Mayflower Compact. Although setting an invaluable precedent for later written constitutions, this document was not a constitution at all. It was a simple agreement to form a crude government and to submit to the will of the majority under the regulations agreed upon. The compact was signed by 41 adult males, 11 of them with the exalted rank of Mr., though not by the servants, and 2 seamen. The pact was a promising step toward genuine self-government, for soon the adult male settlers were assembling to make their own laws in open discussion town meetings, a vital laboratory of liberty. The Pilgrims' first winter of 1620 to 1621 took a grisly toll. Only 44 out of the 102 survived. At one time, only 7 were well enough to lay the dead in their frosty graves. Yet when the Mayflower sailed back to England in the spring, not a single one of the courageous band of the separatists left. As one of them wrote, "It is not with us as with other men, whom small things can discourage." God made his children prosperous, so the Pilgrims believed. The next autumn, that of 1621, brought bountiful harvests, and with them the first Thanksgiving Day in New England. In time, the frail colony found sound economic legs in fur, fish, and lumber. The beaver and the Bible were the early mainstays, the one for the sustenance of the body, the other for the sustenance of the soul. Plymouth proved that the English could maintain themselves in this uninviting region. The Pilgrims were extremely fortunate in their leaders. Prominent among them was the cultured William Bradford, a self-taught scholar who read Hebrew, Greek, Latin, French, and Dutch. He was chosen governor 30 times in the annual elections. Among his major worries was his fear that independent, non-Puritan settlers on their particular might corrupt his godly experiment in the wilderness. Bustling fishing villages and other settlements did sprout to the north of Plymouth, on the storm-lashed shores of Massachusetts Bay, where many people were as much interested in cod as God. Quiet and quaint, the little colony of Plymouth was never important economically or numerically. Its population numbered only 7,000 by 1691, when, still charterless, it merged with its giant neighbor, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, but the tiny settlement of Pilgrims was big both morally and spiritually. The separatist Pilgrims were dedicated extremists, the purest Puritans. More moderate Puritans sought to reform the Church of England from within. Though resented by bishops and monarchs, they slowly gathered support, especially in Parliament. But when Charles I dismissed Parliament in 1629 and sanctioned the anti-Puritan persecutions of the reactionary Archbishop William Laud, many Puritans saw catastrophe in the making. In 1629, an energetic group of non-separatist Puritans, feared for their faith and for England's future, secured a royal charter to form the Massachusetts Bay Company. They proposed to establish a sizable settlement in the infertile Massachusetts area, with Boston soon becoming its hub. Stealing a march on both king and church, the newcomers brought their charter with them. For many years they used it as a kind of constitution, out of easy reach of royal authority. They steadfastly denied that they wanted to separate from the Church of England, only from its impurities. But back in England, the highly orthodox Archbishop Laud snorted that the Bay Colony Puritans were swine which rooted in God's vineyard. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was singularly blessed. The well-equipped expedition of 1630, with 11 vessels carrying nearly 1,000 immigrants, started the colony off on a larger scale than any of the other English settlements. Continuing turmoil in England tossed up additional enriching waves of Puritans on the shores of Massachusetts in the following decade. During the Great English Migration of the 1630s, about 70,000 refugees left England. But not all of them were Puritans, and only about 20,000 came to Massachusetts. Many were attracted to the warm and fertile West Indies, especially the sugar-rich island of Barbados. More Puritans came to this Caribbean islet than to all of Massachusetts. Many fairly prosperous, educated persons immigrated to the Bay Colony, including John Winthrop, a well-to-do pillar of English society, who became the colony's first governor. A successful attorney and manor lord in England, Winthrop eagerly accepted the offer to become governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, believing that he had a calling from God to lead the new religious experiment. He served as governor or deputy governor for 19 years. The resources and skills of talented settlers like Winthrop helped Massachusetts prosper as fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding blossomed into important industries, especially fish and ships. The Massachusetts Bay Colony rapidly shot to the fore as both the biggest and the most influential of the New England outposts. Massachusetts also benefited from a shared sense of purpose among most of the first settlers. "We shall be as a city upon a hill, a beacon to humanity," declared Governor Winthrop. The Puritan Bay colonists believed that they had a covenant with God, an agreement to build a holy society that would be a model for humankind. These common convictions deeply shaped the infant colony's life. Soon after the colonists' arrival, the franchise was extended to all freemen, adult males who belonged to the Puritan congregations, which in time came to be called collectively the Congregational Church. Unchurched men remained voteless in provincial elections, as did all women. On this basis, about 2/5 of adult males enjoyed the franchise in provincial affairs, a far larger proportion than in contemporary England. Town governments, which conducted much important business, were even more inclusive. There, all male property holders, and in some cases other residents as well, enjoyed the priceless boon of publicly discussing local issues, often with much heat and of voting on them by a majority rule show of hands. Yet the provincial government, liberal by the standards of the time, was not a democracy. The able Governor Winthrop feared and distrusted the commons as the meaner sort, and thought that democracy was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. "If the people be governors," asked one Puritan clergyman, "who shall be governed?" True, the freemen annually elected the governor and his assistants, as well as a representative assembly called the General Court. But only Puritans, the visible saints, who alone were eligible for church membership, could be freemen. And according to the doctrine of the covenant, the whole purpose of government was to enforce God's laws, which applied to believers and non-believers alike. Moreover, non-believers as well as believers paid taxes for the government-supported church. Religious leaders thus wielded enormous influence in the Massachusetts Bible Commonwealth. They powerfully influenced admission to church membership by conducting public interrogations of persons claiming to have experienced conversion. Prominent among the early clergy was fiery John Cotton. Educated at England's Cambridge University, a Puritan citadel, he immigrated to Massachusetts to avoid persecution for his criticism of the Church of England. In the Bay Colony, he devoted his considerable learning to defending the government's duty to enforce religious rules. Profoundly pious, he sometimes preached and prayed up to 6 hours in a single day. But the power of the preachers was not absolute. A congregation had the right to hire and fire its minister and to set his salary. Clergymen were also barred from holding formal political office. Puritans in England had suffered too much at the hands of a political Anglican clergy to permit in the New World another unholy union of religious and government power. In a limited way, the Bay colonists thus endorsed the idea of the separation of church and state. The Puritans were a worldly lot, despite or even because of their spiritual intensity. Like John Winthrop, they believed in the doctrine of a calling to do God's work on earth. They shared in what was later called the Protestant ethic, which involved serious commitment to work and to engagement in worldly pursuits. Legend to the contrary, they also enjoyed simple pleasures. They ate plentifully, drank heartily, sang songs occasionally, and made love mostly monogamously. Like other peoples of their time in both America and Europe, they passed laws aimed at making sure these pleasures stayed simple by repressing certain human instincts. In New Haven, for example, a young married couple was fined 20 shillings for the crime of kissing in public, and in later years Connecticut came to be dubbed the Blue Law State. It was so named for the blue paper on which the repressive laws, also known as sumptuary laws, were printed. Yet to the Puritans, life was serious business, and hellfire was real, a hell where sinners shriveled and shrieked in vain for divine mercy. An immensely popular poem in New England, selling 1 copy for every 20 people, was clergyman Michael Wigglesworth's Day of Doom. Especially horrifying were his descriptions of the fate of the damned. They cry, they roar for anguish sore, and gnaw their tongues for horror, but get away without delay. Christ pities not your cry. Depart to hell, there may you yell, and roar eternally. The Bay Colony enjoyed a high degree of social harmony, stemming from common beliefs in its early years. But even in this tightly knit community, dissension soon appeared. Quakers, who flouted the authority of the Puritan clergy, were persecuted with fines, floggings, and banishment. In one extreme case, 4 Quakers who defied expulsion, one of them a woman, were hanged on the Boston Common. A sharp challenge to Puritan orthodoxy came from Anne Hutchinson. She was an exceptionally intelligent, strong-willed, and talkative woman, ultimately the mother of 14 children. Swift and sharp in theological argument, she carried to logical extremes the Puritan doctrine of predestination. She claimed that a holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and that the truly saved need not bother to obey the law of either God or man. This assertion, known as antinomianism, from the Greek against the law, was high heresy. Brought to trial in 1638, the quick-witted Hutchinson bamboozled her clerical inquisitors for days, until she eventually boasted that she had come by her beliefs through a direct revelation from God. This was even higher heresy. The Puritan magistrates had little choice but to banish her, lest she pollute the entire Puritan experiment. With her family, she set out on foot for Rhode Island, though pregnant. She finally moved to New York, where she and all but one of her household were killed by Indians. Back in the Bay Colony, the pious John Winthrop saw God's hand in her fate. More threatening to the Puritan leaders was a personable and popular Salem minister, Roger Williams. Williams was a young man with radical ideas and an unrestrained tongue. An extreme separatist, he hounded his fellow clergymen to make a clean break with the corrupt Church of England. He also challenged the legality of the Bay Colony's charter, which he condemned for expropriating the land from the Indians without fair compensation. As if all this were not enough, he went on to deny the authority of civil government to regulate religious behavior, a seditious blow at the Puritan idea of government's very purpose. Their patience exhausted by 1635, the Bay Colony authorities found Williams guilty of disseminating new and dangerous opinions and ordered him banished. He was permitted to remain several months longer because of illness, but he kept up his criticisms. The outraged magistrates, fearing that he might organize a rival colony of malcontents, made plans to exile him to England, but Williams foiled them. Aided by friendly Indians, Roger Williams fled to the Rhode Island area in 1636, in the midst of a bitter winter. At Providence, the courageous and far-visioned Williams built a Baptist church, probably the first in America. He established complete freedom of religion, even for Jews and Catholics. He demanded no oaths regarding religious beliefs, no compulsory attendance at worship, no taxes to support a state church. He even sheltered the abused Quakers, although disagreeing sharply with their views. Williams' endorsement of religious tolerance made Rhode Island more liberal than any of the other English settlements in the New World, and more advanced than most Old World communities as well. Those outcasts who clustered about Roger Williams enjoyed additional blessings. They exercised simple manhood suffrage from the start, though this broad-minded practice was later narrowed by a property qualification. Opposed to special privilege of any sort, the intrepid Rhode Islanders managed to achieve remarkable freedom of opportunity. Other scattered settlements soon dotted Rhode Island. They consisted largely of malcontents and exiles, some of whom could not bear the stifling theological atmosphere of the Bay Colony. Many of these restless souls in Rogues Island, including Anne Hutchinson, had little in common with Roger Williams, except being unwelcome anywhere else. The Puritan clergy back in Boston sneered at Rhode Island as that sewer in which the Lord's debris had collected and rotted. Planted by dissenters and exiles, Rhode Island became strongly individualistic and stubbornly independent. With good reason, Little Rhodey was later known as the traditional home of the otherwise minded. Begun as a squatter colony in 1636 without legal standing, it finally established rights to the soil when it secured a charter from Parliament in 1644. A huge bronze statue of the independent man appropriately stands today on the dome of the State House in Providence. The smiling valley of the Connecticut River, one of the few highly fertile expanses of any size in all New England, had meanwhile attracted a sprinkling of Dutch and English settlers. Hartford was founded in 1635. The next year witnessed a spectacular beginning of the centuries-long westward movement across the continent. An energetic group of Boston Puritans, led by the Reverend Thomas Hooker, swarmed as a body into the Hartford area, with the ailing Mrs. Hooker carried on a horse litter. 3 years later, in 1639, the settlers of the new Connecticut River Colony drafted an open meeting, a trailblazing document known as the Fundamental Orders. It was, in effect, a modern constitution, which established a regime democratically controlled by the substantial citizens. Essential features of the Fundamental Orders were later borrowed by Connecticut for its colonial charter and ultimately for its state constitution. Another flourishing Connecticut settlement began to spring up at New Haven in 1638. It was a prosperous community, founded by Puritans who contrived to set up an even closer church-government alliance than in Massachusetts. Although only squatters without a charter, the colonists dreamed of making New Haven a bustling seaport, but they fell into disfavor with Charles II as a result of having sheltered 2 of the judges who had condemned his father, Charles I, to death. In 1662, to the acute distress of the New Havenites, the Crown granted a charter to Connecticut that merged New Haven with the more democratic settlements in the Connecticut Valley. Far to the north, enterprising fishermen and fur traders had been active on the coast of Maine for a dozen or so years before the founding of Plymouth. After disheartening attempts at colonization in 1623 by Sir Fernando Jorges, this land of lakes and forests was absorbed by Massachusetts Bay after a formal purchase in 1677 from the Jorges heir. It remained a part of Massachusetts for nearly a century and a half before becoming a separate state. Granite-ribbed New Hampshire also sprang from the fishing and trading activities along its narrow coast. It was absorbed in 1641 by the grasping Bay Colony under a strained interpretation of the Massachusetts Charter. The king, annoyed by this display of greed, arbitrarily separated New Hampshire from Massachusetts in 1679 and made it a royal colony. The spread of English settlements inevitably led to clashes with the Indians, who were particularly weak in New England. Shortly before the Pilgrims had arrived at Plymouth in 1620, an epidemic, probably triggered by contact with English fishermen, had swept through the coastal tribes and killed more than 3/4 of the native people. Deserted Indian fields, ready for tillage, greeted the Plymouth settlers, and scattered skulls and bones provided grim evidence of the impact of the disease. In no position to resist the English incursion, the local Wampanoag Indians at first befriended the settlers. Cultural accommodation was facilitated by Squanto, a Wampanoag who had learned English from a ship's captain who had kidnapped him some years earlier. The Wampanoag chieftain Massasoit signed a treaty with the Plymouth Pilgrims in 1621 and helped them celebrate the first Thanksgiving after the autumn harvests that same year. As more English settlers arrived and pushed inland into the Connecticut River Valley, confrontations between Indians and whites ruptured these peaceful relations. Hostilities exploded in 1637 between the English settlers and the powerful Pequot tribe. Besieging a Pequot village on Connecticut's Mystic River, English militiamen and their Narragansett Indian allies set fire to the Indian wigwams and shot the fleeing survivors. The slaughter wrote a brutal finish to the Pequot War, virtually annihilating the Pequot tribe, and inaugurated 4 decades of uneasy peace between Puritans and Indians. Lashed by critics in England, the Puritans made some feeble efforts at converting the remaining Indians to Christianity, although Puritan missionary zeal never equaled that of the Catholic Spanish and French. A mere handful of Indians were gathered into Puritan praying towns to make the acquaintance of the English God and to learn the ways of English culture. The Indians' only hope for wresting English encroachment lay in intertribal unity, a pan-Indian alliance against the swiftly spreading English settlements. In 1675, Massasoit's son, Metacom, called King Philip by the English, forged such an alliance and mounted a series of coordinated assaults on English villages throughout New England. Frontier settlements were especially hard hit, and refugees fell back toward the relative safety of Boston. When the war ended in 1676, 52 Puritan towns had been attacked, and 12 destroyed entirely. Hundreds of colonists and many more Indians lay dead. Metacom's wife and son were sold into slavery. He himself was captured, beheaded, and drawn and quartered. His head was carried on a pike back to Plymouth, where it was mounted on grisly display for years. King Philip's War slowed the westward march of English settlement in New England for several decades, but the war inflicted a lasting defeat on New England's Indians. Drastically reduced in numbers, dispirited, and disbanded, they thereafter posed only sporadic threats to the New England colonists. A path-breaking experiment in union was launched in 1643 when 4 colonies banded together to form the New England Confederation. The English Civil War was then deeply distracting Old England, throwing the colonists upon their own resources. The primary purpose of the Confederation was defense against foes, or potential foes, notably the Indians, the French, and the Dutch. Purely intercolonial problems, such as runaway servants and criminals who had fled from one colony to another, also came within the jurisdiction of the Confederation. Each member colony, regardless of size, wielded 2 votes, an arrangement highly displeasing to the most populous colony, Massachusetts Bay. The Confederation was essentially an exclusive Puritan club. It consisted of the 2 Massachusetts colonies, the Bay Colony and Bantam-sized Plymouth, and the 2 Connecticut colonies, New Haven and the scattered valley settlements. The Puritan leaders blackballed Rhode Island as well as the Maine outposts. These places, it was charged, harbored too many heretical or otherwise undesirable characters. Shockingly, one of the Maine towns had made a tailor its mayor and had even sheltered an excommunicated minister of the gospel. Weak though it was, the Confederation was the first notable milestone on the long and rocky road toward colonial unity. The delegates took tottering but long overdue steps toward acting together on matters of intercolonial importance. Rank-and-file colonists, for their part, received valuable experience in delegating their votes to properly chosen representatives. Back in England, the king had paid little attention to the American colonies during the early years of their planting. They were allowed, in effect, to become semi-autonomous commonwealths. This area of benign neglect was prolonged when the crown, struggling to retain its power, became enmeshed during the 1640s in civil wars with the parliamentarians. But when Charles II was restored to the English throne in 1660, the Royalists and their Church of England allies were once more firmly in the saddle. Puritan hopes of eventually purifying the old English Church withered. Worse, Charles II was determined to take an active, aggressive hand in the management of the colonies. His plans ran headlong against the habits that decades of relative independence had bred in the colonists. Deepening colonial defiance was nowhere more glaringly revealed than in Massachusetts. One of the king's agents in Boston was mortified to find that royal orders had no more effect than old issues of the London Gazette. Punishment was soon forthcoming. As a slap at Massachusetts, Charles II gave rival Connecticut in 1662 a sea-to-sea charter grant, which legalized the squatter settlements. The very next year, the outcasts in Rhode Island received a new charter, which gave kingly sanction to the most religiously tolerant government yet devised in America. A final and crushing blow fell on the stiff-necked Bay Colony in 1684, when its precious charter was revoked by the London authorities. Massachusetts suffered further humiliation in 1686 when the Dominion of New England was created by royal authority. Unlike the homegrown New England Confederation, it was imposed from London. Embracing at first all of New England, it was expanded 2 years later to include New York and East and West Jersey. The Dominion was also aimed at bolstering colonial defense in the event of war with the Indians, and hence, from the imperial viewpoint of Parliament, was a statesmanlike move. More importantly, the Dominion of New England was designed to promote urgently needed efficiency in the administration of the English navigation laws. Those laws reflected the intensifying colonial rivalries of the 17th century. They sought to stitch England's overseas possessions more tightly to the motherland by throttling American trade with countries not ruled by the English crown. Like colonial people everywhere, the Americans chafed at such confinements, and smuggling became an increasingly common and honorable occupation. At the head of the new dominion stood autocratic Sir Edmund Andros, an able English military man, conscientious but tactless. Establishing headquarters in puritanical Boston, he generated much hostility by his open affiliation with the despised Church of England. The colonists were also outraged by his noisy and Sabbath-profaning soldiers, who were accused of teaching the people to drink, blaspheme, curse, and damn. Andros was prompt to use the mailed fist. He ruthlessly curbed the cherished town meetings, laid heavy restrictions on the courts, the press, and the schools, and revoked all land titles. Dispensing with the popular assemblies, he taxed the people without the consent of their duly elected representatives. He also strove to enforce the unpopular navigation laws and suppress smuggling. Liberty-loving colonists, accustomed to unusual privileges during long decades of neglect, were goaded to the verge of revolt. The people of Old England soon taught the people of New England a few lessons in resisting oppression. In 1688 to 1689, the English engineered the memorable Glorious, or Bloodless Revolution. Dethroning the despotic and unpopular Catholic James II, they enthroned the Protestant rulers of the Netherlands, the Dutch-born William III and his English wife, Mary II, daughter of James II. When the news of the Glorious Revolution reached America, the ramshackle dominion of New England collapsed like a house of cards. A Boston mob, catching the fever, rose against the existing regime. Sir Edmund Andros attempted to flee in women's clothing, but was betrayed by boots protruding beneath his dress. He was hastily shipped off to England. Massachusetts, though rid of the despotic Andros, did not gain as much from the upheaval as it had hoped. In 1691, it was arbitrarily made a royal colony, with a new charter and a new royal governor. The permanent loss of the ancient charter was a staggering blow to the proud Puritans, who never fully recovered. Worst of all, the privilege of voting, once a monopoly of church members, was now to be enjoyed by all qualified male property holders. England's Glorious Revolution reverberated throughout the colonies from New England to the Chesapeake. Inspired by the challenge to the crown in Old England, many colonists seized the occasion to strike against royal authority in America. Unrest rocked both New York and Maryland from 1689 to 1691, until newly appointed royal governors restored a semblance of order. Most importantly, the new monarchs relaxed the royal grip on colonial trade, inaugurating a period of salutary neglect, when the much-resented navigation laws were only weakly enforced. Yet residues remained of Charles II's effort to assert tighter administrative control over his empire. More English officials, judges, clerks, customs officials, now staffed the courts and strolled the wharves of English America. Many were incompetent, corrupt hacks who knew little and cared less about American affairs. Appointed by influential patrons in far-off England, they blocked the rise of local leaders to positions of political power by their very presence. Aggrieved Americans viewed them with mounting contempt and resentment as the 18th century wore on. Late in the 16th century, the oppressed people of the Netherlands unfurled the standard of rebellion against Catholic Spain. After bloody and protracted fighting, they finally succeeded, with the aid of Protestant England, in winning their independence. The 17th century, the era of Rembrandt and other famous artists, was a golden age in Dutch history. This vigorous little lowland nation finally emerged as a major commercial and naval power, and then it ungratefully challenged the supremacy of its former benefactor, England. 3 great Anglo-Dutch naval wars were fought in the 17th century with as many as 100 ships on each side. The sturdy Dutch dealt blows about as heavy as they received. The Dutch Republic also became a leading colonial power, with by far its greatest activity in the East Indies. There it maintained an enormous and profitable empire for over 300 years. The Dutch East India Company was virtually a state within a state, and at one time supported an army of 10,000 men and a fleet of 190 ships, 40 of them men of war. Seeking greater riches, this enterprising company employed an English explorer, Henry Hudson. Disregarding orders to sail northeast, he ventured into Delaware Bay and New York Bay in 1609, and then ascended the Hudson River, hoping that at last he had chanced upon the coveted shortcut through the continent. But, as the event proved, he merely filed a Dutch claim to a magnificently wooded and watered area. Much less powerful than the mighty Dutch East India Company was the Dutch West India Company, which maintained profitable enterprises in the Caribbean. At times it was less interested in trading than in raiding, and at one fell swoop in 1628 captured a fleet of Spanish treasure ships laden with loot worth $15 million. The company also established outposts in Africa and a thriving sugar industry in Brazil, which for several decades was its principal center of activity in the New World. New Netherland, in the beautiful Hudson River area, was planted in 1623 to 1624 on a permanent basis. Established by the Dutch West India Company for its quick profit fur trade, it was never more than a secondary interest of the founders. The company's most brilliant stroke was to buy Manhattan Island from the Indians, who did not actually own it, for virtually worthless trinkets, 22,000 acres of what is now perhaps the most valuable real estate in the world for pennies per acre. New Amsterdam, later New York City, was a company town. It was run by and for the Dutch company in the interests of the stockholders. The investors had no enthusiasm for religious toleration, free speech, or democratic practices, and the governors appointed by the company as directors general were usually harsh and despotic. Religious dissenters who opposed the official Dutch Reformed Church were regarded with suspicion, and for a while Quakers were savagely abused. In response to repeated protests by the aggravated colonists, a local body with limited lawmaking power was finally established. This picturesque Dutch colony took on a strangely aristocratic tint and retained it for generations. Vast feudal estates fronting the Hudson River, known as patroonships, were granted to promoters who agreed to settle 50 people on them. One patroonship in the Albany area was slightly larger than the later state of Rhode Island. Colorful little New Amsterdam attracted a cosmopolitan population, as is common in seaport towns. 23 Jews arrived in 1654, refugees from religious persecution in Catholic Brazil, a harbinger of the city's later reputation as a haven for the homeless and the harried. A French Jesuit missionary visiting in the 1640s noted that 18 different languages were being spoken in the streets. New York's later babel of immigrant tongues was thus foreshadowed. Vexations beset the Dutch company colony from the beginning. The directors general were largely incompetent. Company shareholders demanded their dividends, even at the expense of the colony's welfare. The Indians, infuriated by Dutch cruelties, retaliated with horrible massacres. As a defense measure, the hard-pressed settlers on Manhattan Island erected a stout wall, from which Wall Street derives its name. New England was hostile to the growth of its Dutch neighbor, and the people of Connecticut finally ejected intruding Hollanders from their verdant valley. The Swedes also trespassed on Dutch preserves from 1638 to 1655 by planting the anemic colony of New Sweden on the Delaware River. This was the golden age of Sweden, during and following the 30 Years' War of 1618 to 1648, in which its brilliant king Gustavus Adolphus had carried the torch for Protestantism. This outburst of energy in Sweden caused it to enter the costly colonial game in America, though on something of a shoestring. Resenting the Swedish intrusion on the Delaware, the Dutch dispatched a small military expedition in 1655. It was led by the ablest of the directors general, Peter Stuyvesant, who had lost a leg while soldiering in the West Indies and was dubbed Father Wooden Leg by the Indians. The main fort fell after a bloodless siege, whereupon Swedish rule came to an abrupt end. The colonists were absorbed by New Netherland. New Sweden, never important, soon faded away, leaving behind in later Delaware a sprinkling of Swedish place names and Swedish log cabins, the first in America, as well as an admixture of Swedish blood. Lacking vitality and representing only a secondary commercial interest of the Dutch, New Netherland lay under the menacing shadow of the vigorous English colonies to the north. In addition, it was honeycombed with New England immigrants. Numbering about one half of New Netherland's 10,000 souls in 1664, they might in time have seized control from within. The days of the Dutch on the Hudson were numbered, for the English regarded them as intruders. In 1664, after the imperially ambitious Charles II had granted the area to his brother, the Duke of York, a strong English squadron appeared off the decrepit defenses of New Amsterdam. A fuming Peter Stuyvesant, short of all munitions except courage, was forced to surrender without firing a shot. New Amsterdam was thereupon renamed New York, in honor of the Duke of York. England won a splendid harbor, strategically located in the middle of the mainland colonies, and the stately Hudson River penetrating the interior. With the removal of this foreign wedge, the English banner now waved triumphantly over a solid stretch of territory from Maine to the Carolinas. The conquered Dutch province tenaciously retained many of the illiberal features of earlier days. An autocratic spirit survived, and the aristocratic element gained strength when certain corrupt English governors granted immense acreage to their favorites. Influential landowning families, such as the Livingstons and the Delanceys, wielded disproportionate power in the affairs of colonial New York. These monopolistic land policies, combined with the lordly atmosphere, discouraged many European immigrants from coming. The physical growth of New York was correspondingly retarded. The Dutch peppered place names over the land, including Harlem, Brooklyn, and Hellgate. They likewise left their imprint on the gambrel-roofed architecture. As for social customs and folkways, no other foreign group of comparable size has made so colorful a contribution. Noteworthy are Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf, a dangerous game played with heavy clubs and forbidden in settled areas. A remarkable group of dissenters, commonly known as Quakers, arose in England during the mid-1600s. Their name derived from the report that they quaked when under deep religious emotion. Officially, they were known as the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers were especially offensive to the authorities, both religious and civil. They refused to support the established Church of England with taxes. They built simple meeting houses, congregated without a paid clergy, and spoke up themselves in meetings when moved. Believing that they were all children in the sight of God, they kept their broad-brimmed hats on in the presence of their betters, and addressed others with simple thees and thous, rather than with conventional titles. They would take no oaths, because Jesus had commanded, "Swear not at all." This peculiarity often embroiled them with government officials, for test oaths were still required to establish the fact that a person was not a Roman Catholic. The Quakers, beyond a doubt, were a people of deep conviction. They abhorred strife and warfare and refused military service. As advocates of passive resistance, they would turn the other cheek and rebuild their meeting house on the site where their enemies had torn it down. Their courage and devotion to principle finally triumphed. Although at times they seemed stubborn and unreasonable, they were a simple, devoted, democratic people, contending in their own high-minded way for religion and civic freedom. William Penn, a well-born and athletic young Englishman, was attracted to the Quaker faith in 1660, when only 16 years old. His father, disapproving, administered a sound flogging. After various adventures in the army, the best portrait of the peaceful Quaker has him in armor. The youth firmly embraced the despised faith and suffered much persecution. The courts branded him a saucy and impertinent fellow. Several hundred of his less fortunate fellow Quakers died of cruel treatment, and thousands more were fined, flogged, or cast into dank prisons. Penn's thoughts naturally turned to the New World, where a sprinkling of Quakers had already fled, notably to Rhode Island, North Carolina, and New Jersey. Eager to establish an asylum for his people, he also hoped to experiment with liberal ideas in government and at the same time make a profit. Finally, in 1681, he managed to secure from the king an immense grant of fertile land, in consideration of a monetary debt owed to his deceased father by the crown. The king called the area Pennsylvania, in honor of the sire. The modest son, fearing that critics would accuse him of naming it after himself, sought unsuccessfully to change the name. Pennsylvania was by far the best advertised of all the colonies. Its founder, the first American advertising man, sent out paid agents and distributed countless pamphlets printed in English, Dutch, French, and German. Unlike the lures of many other American real estate promoters, then and later, Penn's inducements were generally truthful. He especially welcomed forward-looking spirits and substantial citizens, including industrious carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. His liberal land policy, which encouraged substantial holdings, was instrumental in attracting a heavy inflow of immigrants. Penn formally launched his colony in 1681. His task was simplified by the presence of several thousand squatters, Dutch, Swedish, English, Welsh, who were already scattered along the banks of the Delaware River. Philadelphia, meaning brotherly love in Greek, was more carefully planned than most colonial cities, and consequently enjoyed wide and attractive streets. Penn farsightedly bought land from the Indians, including Chief Tammany, later patron saint of New York's political Tammany Hall. His treatment of the native peoples was so fair that the Quaker broad-brims went among them unarmed and even employed them as babysitters. For a brief period, Pennsylvania seemed the promised land of amicable Indian-white relations. Some southern tribes even migrated to Pennsylvania, seeking the Quaker heaven. But ironically, Quaker tolerance proved the undoing of Quaker Indian policy. As non-Quaker European immigrants flooded into the province, they undermined the Quakers' own benevolent policy toward the Indians. The feisty Scots-Irish were particularly unpersuaded by Quaker idealism. Penn's new proprietary regime was unusually liberal and included a representative assembly elected by the landowners. No tax-supported state church drained coffers or demanded allegiance. Freedom of worship was guaranteed to all residents, although Penn, under pressure from London, was forced to deny Catholics and Jews the privilege of voting or holding office. The death penalty was imposed only for treason and murder, as compared with some 200 capital crimes in England. Among other noteworthy features, no provision was made by the peace-loving Quakers of Pennsylvania for a military defense. No restrictions were placed on immigration, and naturalization was made easy. The humane Quakers early developed a strong dislike of black slavery, and in the genial glow of Pennsylvania, some progress was made towards social reform. With its many liberal features, Pennsylvania attracted a rich mix of ethnic groups. They included numerous religious misfits who were repelled by the harsh practices of neighboring colonies. This Quaker refuge boasted a surprisingly modern atmosphere in an unmodern age, and to an unusual degree afforded economic opportunity, civil liberty, and religious freedom. Even so, blue laws prohibited ungodly revelers, stage plays, playing cards, dice, games, and excessive hilarity. Under such generally happy auspices, Penn's brainchild grew lustily. The Quakers were shrewd business people, and in a short time the settlers were exporting grain and other foodstuffs. Within 2 years, Philadelphia claimed 300 houses and 2,500 people. Within 19 years, by 1700, the colony was surpassed in population and wealth only by long-established Virginia and Massachusetts. William Penn, who altogether spent about 4 years in Pennsylvania, was never fully appreciated by his colonists. His governors, some of them incompetent and tactless, quarreled bitterly with the people, who were constantly demanding greater political control. Penn himself became too friendly with James II, the deposed Catholic king. Thrice arrested for treason, thrust for a time into a debtor's prison, and afflicted by a paralytic stroke, he died full of sorrows. His enduring monument was not only a noble experiment in government, but also a new commonwealth, based on civil and religious liberty, and dedicated to freedom of conscience and worship, it held aloft a hopeful torch in a world of semi-darkness. Small Quaker settlements flourished next door to Pennsylvania. New Jersey was started in 1664 when two noble proprietors received the area from the Duke of York. A substantial number of New Englanders, including many whose weary soil had petered out, flocked to the new colony. One of the proprietors sold West New Jersey in 1674 to a group of Quakers, who here set up a sanctuary even before Pennsylvania was launched. East New Jersey was also acquired in later years by the Quakers, whose wings were clipped in 1702, when the Crown combined the two Jerseys in a royal colony. Swedish-tinged Delaware consisted of only 3 counties, 2 at high tide, the witticism goes, and was named after Lord Delaware, the harsh military governor who had arrived in Virginia in 1610. Harboring some Quakers and closely associated with Penn's prosperous colony, Delaware was granted its own assembly in 1703. But until the American Revolution, it remained under the governor of Pennsylvania. The Middle Colonies, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania, enjoyed certain features in common. In general, the soil was fertile and the expanse of land was broad, unlike rock-bestrewn New England. Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey came to be known as the bread colonies by virtue of their heavy exports of grain. Rivers also played a vital role. Broad, languid streams, notably the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, tapped the fur trade of the interior and beckoned adventuresome spirits into the back country. The rivers had few cascading waterfalls, unlike New England's, and hence presented little inducement to milling or manufacturing with water-wheel power. A surprising amount of industry nonetheless hummed in the Middle Colonies. Virginal forests abounded for lumbering and shipbuilding. The presence of deep-water estuaries and landlocked harbors stimulated both commerce and the growth of seaports, such as New York and Philadelphia. Even Albany, more than 100 miles up the Hudson, was a port of some consequence in colonial days. The Middle Colonies were in many respects midway between New England and the Southern plantation group. Except in aristocratic New York, the land holdings were generally intermediate in size, smaller than the plantations south, but larger than in small farm New England. Local government lay somewhere between the personalized town meeting of New England and the diffuse county government of the South. There were fewer industries in the Middle Colonies than in New England, more than in the South. Yet the Middle Colonies, which in some ways were the most American part of America, could claim certain distinctions in their own right. Generally speaking, the population was more ethnically mixed than that of other settlements. The people were blessed with an unusual degree of religious toleration and democratic control. Earnest and devout Quakers, in particular, made a compassionate contribution to human freedom out of all proportion to their numbers. Desirable land was more easily acquired in the Middle Colonies than in New England, or in the tidewater South. One result was that a considerable amount of economic and social democracy prevailed, though less so in aristocratic New York. Modern-minded Benjamin Franklin, often regarded as the most representative American personality of his era, was a child of the Middle Colonies. Although it is true that Franklin was born a Yankee in puritanical Boston, he entered Philadelphia as a 17-year-old in 1720 with a loaf of bread under each arm and immediately found a congenial home in the urbane, open atmosphere of what was then North America's biggest city. One Pennsylvanian later boasted that Franklin came to life at 17 in Philadelphia. By the time Franklin arrived in the city of brotherly love, the American colonies were themselves coming to life. Population was growing robustly. Transportation and communication were gradually improving. The British, for the most part, continued their hands-off policies, leaving the colonists to fashion their own local governments, run their own churches, and develop networks of intercolonial trade. As people and products crisscrossed the colonies with increasing frequency and increasing volume, Americans began to realize that, far removed from Mother England, they were not merely surviving, but truly thriving.